January 18, 1962. South Vietnam. The first UC-123 aircraft of the U.S. Air Force's 309th Air Commando Squadron lifts off, its belly tanks heavy with a new weapon. The mission is called Operation Ranch Hand. The target is the jungle. The victims will be counted in millions. The Vietnam War is still officially an advisory mission. The United States has not yet deployed full combat units. Ngo Dinh Diem rules South Vietnam with U.S. backing. His government is fragile, threatened by guerrillas and rural insurgency. American planners see an invisible battlefield under the tree canopy. They fear ambush, supply trails, and hidden food caches. In late 1961, South Vietnam's president requests chemical help. He asks Washington for aerial spraying to strip jungle cover and destroy crops. Inside the White House, the idea is controversial but attractive. It promises a technological solution to a political war. By January 1962, the decision is made. The first Ranch Hand sorties launch from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The public description is simple and controlled. Ranch Hand is described as a herbicide program, not chemical warfare. Officials argue that these are agricultural chemicals used on American farms. They insist the target is plants, not people. Secretary of State Dean Rusk assures President Kennedy the program is legal. He states that defoliants do not violate international law on chemical warfare. U.S. statements frame the missions as defensive. They are said to protect troops, open roads, and deny guerrillas concealment. Press references are brief and technical, and they refer to vegetation control, crop denial, and jungle clearing. There is no mention of long-term toxicity in public briefings. There is no discussion of dioxin or genetic damage on the record. To the public, this is another military innovation. To planners, it is a scalable system, flight lines, tonnage, coverage maps. On the ground, the missions do not match the clean language. Herbicide lines cut through villages, orchards, and rice paddies. The aircraft fly low and slow. Spray swathes drift beyond planned target boxes in shifting winds. From 1962 onward, Vietnamese civilians report immediate effects. Leaves blacken, crops fail, livestock fall ill. Children develop unexplained rashes and respiratory problems. Pregnant women miscarry in clusters along heavily sprayed corridors. These reports rarely appear in U.S. press coverage at the time. They circulate instead in village accounts, local petitions, and internal reports. Inside the U.S. chain of command, some medical officers raise concerns. They note that herbicide concentrations and exposure patterns differ from farm use. But the official message remains stable. Command and civilian leaders insist there is no proven human harm. The most important missing detail is chemical. Agent Orange contains a contaminant, 2,3,7,8-TCDD, a highly toxic dioxin. This contaminant is not explained to the troops handling the drums, nor is it disclosed to the villagers living under the spray routes. Over the next decade, Ranch Hand expands into a sustained campaign. Between 1962 and 1971, nearly 19 to 20 million U.S. gallons of herbicides are sprayed. At least 11 million gallons are Agent Orange alone. Other mixtures, Agents White, Blue, Purple, Pink, and Green, fill the rest. About 20,000 aerial spray sorties fly over South Vietnam. Smaller operations hit parts of Laos and Cambodia. Targets include forest corridors, base perimeters, and infiltration routes. They also include suspected enemy-controlled cropland. In practice, many of these areas are mixed civilian zones. They contain hamlets, farms, and families who have no warning. The chemicals soak soil, water, and food chains. They accumulate in fat tissue and breast milk. American and Allied troops move, eat, and sleep in sprayed environments. Vietnamese villagers drink from contaminated streams and wells. By the late 1960s, US and Vietnamese populations number in the millions across sprayed regions. Many will be exposed repeatedly over years. The toxicity of dioxin was not unknown before ranch hand. Industrial incidents and animal studies had already raised alarms. Internal documents from chemical manufacturers referenced contamination. They documented chloracin, liver damage, and other systemic effects in workers. Military planners had access to emerging toxicology literature. They knew that high doses and large area dispersal represented a different risk profile. In 1965 and 1966, internal studies and contractor reports flagged unusual dioxin levels. They recommended stricter handling and exposure controls. Those warnings did not halt the program. Instead, operations intensified during peak US troop deployments. By 1967, South Vietnam's landscape shows clear defoliation scars in aerial photos. Entire strips of jungle canopy are gone along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and key rivers. Yet ranch hand continues to be described as an accessory operation. It is portrayed as a support measure, not a central strategic weapon. This framing keeps it out of front-page debate. It minimizes scrutiny of both targets and long-term effects. As the war intensifies, herbicide use shifts from experiment to routine. Spray missions become part of standard campaign planning. Commanders request defoliation to clear around bases and outposts. They also request crop destruction in contested zones. Entire rural districts are repeatedly sprayed in overlapping passes. This creates chronic exposure rather than one-time contact. For civilians, the risk is cumulative. They live in the same place, season after season, under the same flight lines. South Vietnamese and Allied troops patrol in contaminated areas. They eat local produce and use local water sources. The dose builds silently in bodies. Dioxin's half-life in human tissue is measured in years. By the late 1960s, US veterans begin to report strange ailments. Skin disorders, nerve problems, and early cancers appear in scattered cases. In Vietnam, patterns of stillbirths and birth defects grow more visible. Local doctors in sprayed provinces describe clusters they cannot explain. There is no comprehensive tracking of these outcomes during the war. There is no integrated system linking health records to spray maps. When the war ends for the United States, the chemical story is unresolved. Ranch hand stops in 1971, 4 years before the final fall of Saigon. So veterans return home with little information about what they handled. Their medical files do not systematically note herbicide exposure. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, US veterans organize. They push for recognition of Agent Orange-related illnesses. Meanwhile, Vietnamese communities live with ongoing health problems. Many live in areas later classified as hotspots for dioxin. The official response in the United States is cautious and defensive. Agencies call for more study but avoid clear acknowledgements of causation. A crucial moment comes with a large epidemiological effort. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention undertakes a study of Vietnam veterans. This study becomes the focus of a U.S. congressional investigation. House Report 101-672 later characterizes it as a case of flawed science and political manipulation. Investigators conclude that the CDC changed its study design. They state that it became unlikely to distinguish heavily exposed soldiers from those less exposed. The report finds that military records that could have improved exposure assessment were discredited or set aside. It also finds that White House channels influenced the process through an Agent Orange working group. These findings do not erase the official line but complicate it. They show that key exposure questions were narrowed, delayed, or deflected at high levels. For years, the dominant message is that evidence is inconclusive. This language shapes legal cases, benefits decisions, and public understanding. Over time, independent and international research accumulates. It links exposure to cancers, diabetes, neurological disorders, and reproductive problems. By the 1980s and 1990s, dioxin is widely recognized as a human carcinogen. The Agent Orange contaminant becomes one of the most studied industrial toxins. Vietnamese and international estimates attempt to count victims. The Vietnamese government cites roughly 3 million people affected and 400,000 deaths. These numbers are disputed and sometimes labeled unreliable in US statements. But they align with the scale of spraying and the persistence of dioxin in the environment. Recent econometric work examines health data decades after the war. One study finds that civilians in communes with higher herbicide exposure are about 20% more likely to report Agent Orange-related diseases. The same research identifies elevated blood pressure disorders and mobility impairments. The strongest effects appear among those exposed as children or while in utero before 1971. Other studies document birth defects, including cleft palate, extra digits, and severe developmental disabilities in heavily sprayed regions. Dioxin is detected in breast milk and human blood long after hostilities end. Taken together, these data imply exposure on a massive scale. Millions of Vietnamese and hundreds of thousands of Allied troops have lived with the legacy of ranch hand. The poisoning is not a single event. It is a long tail of illness that continues into the present. Under pressure from veterans, the US government begins to shift position. By the late 1970s and 1980s, some conditions are recognized as presumptively linked to Agent Orange for benefit purposes. The Department of Veterans Affairs gradually expands its list of covered diseases. It relies on Institute of Medicine and National Academies reviews for classification. These acknowledgements are narrow and technical. They do not describe the program itself as a mass poisoning campaign. Handled as a compensation issue, Agent Orange becomes a bureaucratic category. It is processed through claims, ratings, and case files. For Vietnamese victims, the path is different. They sue chemical manufacturers in US courts, but their cases are dismissed. In the 2000s, joint US-Vietnam efforts begin to clean up certain hotspots. Sites like Da Nang and Bien Hoa air bases undergo remediation for dioxin-contaminated soil and sediment. These projects acknowledge environmental damage. They do not formally concede the full human cost. The language remains careful. Phrases like possible association and potential health impacts dominate official summaries. The result is an asymmetry. Those living with severe disabilities often hear that their suffering is recognized only statistically, not personally. The concealment of ranch hand's true impact does not rest on a single decision. It emerges from layers of classification, framing, and technical argument. First, the operation is embedded in a larger logistics system. It is one line item within aerial operations and trail interdiction, rather than a standalone scandal. Second, the terminology is neutral and sanitized. Herbicides, defoliation, and vegetation control displace words like poisoning and contamination. Third, the early science is limited by design. Key exposure variables are weakened or omitted in large epidemiological studies. Congressional investigators later describe this as flawed and manipulated. They point to unjustified discrediting of military exposure records by health agencies. Fourth, legal and diplomatic incentives favor uncertainty. If causal links remain unproven, obligations for large-scale compensation remain constrained. Finally, the geographic distance and political context matter. Most of the heavily exposed civilians live in a country devastated by war and cut off from Western media. Their testimony reaches international audiences slowly, if at all. Their medical records form a patchwork, not a unified data set. These factors delay recognition for decades, They allow a large-scale toxic exposure to remain marginal in mainstream war narratives. Declassification, but legal discovery and long-term research gradually change the record. Documents describing the volume of herbicides and mission counts become widely accessible. By the late 1980s and 1990s, congressional hearings and reports bring internal debates to light. House Report 101-67 details interference in Agent Orange research and calls out political manipulation. Scientific reviews consolidate evidence on dioxin toxicity. International bodies classify it as a known human carcinogen with broad systemic effects. Large-scale surveys in Vietnam add a civilian dimension. Studies correlate commune-level spray intensity with higher rates of long-term health problems. Journalistic and academic work reconstructs ranch hands' operational footprint. They map spray missions against settlements and ecological zones. Mine veteran testimony fills in lived experience. Troops describe handling leaking drums, flying through spray clouds, and seeing immediate vegetation kill. Gradually, a different picture takes shape. Ranch hand is no longer just an auxiliary defoliation program. It is a dispersed chemical exposure system on a national scale. The term Agent Orange enters public vocabulary as shorthand for toxic legacy. The operation that once hid behind agricultural language becomes a symbol of invisible harm. Despite decades of work, key questions remain open. No single definitive count exists of how many people were poisoned. Estimates of exposed Vietnamese civilians run into the millions. Estimates of affected US, South Korean, Australian, and other Allied veterans remain contested. Attribution is complex in individual cases. Many diseases linked to dioxin also occur in unexposed populations. This uncertainty continues to shape policy. Governments weigh probabilities, not certainties, when expanding benefits or remediation. Questions also remain about decision-making inside the program. How fully did senior officials understand dioxin risks at the time of escalation? The record shows awareness of toxicity and environmental persistence. It does not show a clear threshold where those concerns took precedence over military utility. In Vietnam, second- and third-generation health impacts raise further issues. Genetic and epigenetic mechanisms are still being studied, with no consensus on full intergenerational effects. The landscape itself remains altered. Certain hotspots around former US bases continue to show high dioxin levels decades later. Operation Ranch. Hand formally ended in 1971. Its consequences did not. In 1962, the official story was about trees and crops. It was about a war fought in the shadows of the jungle canopy. Spray planes flew low over rivers, hamlets, and forest lines. Their cargo was labeled as herbicide, their purpose as defoliation. Behind that language stood 19 to 20 million gallons of chemicals. Inside those drums, dioxin rode the mist into soil, water, and human bodies. The public narrative focused on foliage and tactics, not on long-term health. Early warnings were diluted by cautious phrasing, limited studies, and institutional incentives to doubt. Only years later did a different pattern become clear. Widespread cancers, birth defects, and chronic illness traced back to the spray corridors of the 1960s. Operation Ranch Hand was presented as a way to deny cover and food to an enemy. It also delivered a persistent toxin to civilians and soldiers across an entire region. The full human cost remains only partially documented. The number of lives altered, shortened, or never born cannot be precisely calculated. What began as a classified technical solution became, over time, a slow-moving disaster. Its origins are archived, its effects continue in bodies and landscapes. The sky over South Vietnam is quiet now, but the chemicals released there have not fully left.